Check out the trailer video for this mission first, check out the mission itself, the mode associated with it, just so we all know what we are talking about. Thank you. Feel free to skip to any section that interests you, times are in the video description. First, the short version for people who want a brief overview. The mission works on a grid system. The player's position is approximated to a grid and objects are created based on the grid coordinates. Each square on the grid has a trigger covering its area, and upon activation, a script deletes all objects that are too far away and, if needed, loads new objects. There are outer walls for each grid square. These are always generated around the outside of each grid cell. They are always the same shape and size. Random chance for a door instead of a wall, much more likely around the middle, usually 0, 1 or 2 doors per wall segment. There's also a small chance for a missing wall piece, creating another passage between the segments. The inner walls have been created by hand to avoid many issues. There are 30 layouts designed, and a script picks one of the possible ones, starting with the first 10 and slowly moving up as the mission progresses, keeping the layouts fresh and interesting. I had to make them manually for the following reasons. I had to make sure it would be reminiscent of actual rooms and corridors. I had to prevent walls from clipping through ceiling lights. I had to make sure there is always a way to reach any potential door in the outer wall from anywhere within the room. I had to split up each room so that you don't see new stuff getting generated ahead of you or see the void outside. As I said, the mission does have a structure, it's not just endlessly generating some garbage. As the player explores, rooms slowly change their layouts, visual effects change, overall distance is calculated. There are endings, 3 of them actually, spoilers. First ending is triggered just by walking and exploring. Eventually you should enter enough rooms, walk far enough that you trigger the exit sequence, at which point the game starts placing wall pieces over doors to keep you within the rooms that are already generated, to prevent you from walking away from the exit. At the same time, it waits until you aren't looking and deletes walls and floors inside one of the rooms that you already visited. Since you are trapped in a small number of rooms, eventually you will find the exit and end the mission. For the second ending, you just have to stop moving for long enough, at which point all doors get replaced by walls and trap you. Third ending, you just have to walk around, but slowly, so that you don't explore too far and find the exit. After 20 minutes the mission ends, you haven't found the exit. This is the main core of the mission. Apart from this, there's a couple visual effects. The color palette slowly shifts from desaturated to bright yellow to dark yellow and back to desaturated. If you go without flashlight and there aren't many natural lights around, it's possible that the floor will change from dark yellow to dark brown red due to these visual effects. The actual objects don't change at all though. There's also sound effects that get created around the player and play some subtle sounds. There are also extremely hard to find journal pages of another traveler. Special effects for the compass and watch, those are added for the lore. In the backgrounds, time doesn't always work as we expect, compass or GPS doesn't work, so I tried my best to pay attention to every detail and make the experience as immersive as possible. If player drops anything on the ground, perhaps to help them navigate and map the surroundings, the game will wait until the object is out of sight or far away and delete it. There's a slim chance that a copy of the object will be created elsewhere to confuse the player, but the chances are super small. That's about all there is. The mission went through many different changes. Stuff got cut, abandoned, remade. I didn't get to create an NPC to talk to, a small subsection with stairs and ladders, or an infinite drop, all of which existed at one point, but they were either too much of a hassle to implement properly, or I was lacking some crucial detail to really sell them to the player. So this is what I ended up with. But hey, at least it got made. Anything can be added still. Alright, if you don't want to stick around for the full boring presentation, thanks for watching and I'll see you another time. I would like to talk about each logical part. As you can see now. These are roughly the categories, but of course they are connected to each other, so we'll slowly go over the entire mission and hopefully you will understand how these scripts interact and communicate with each other. Let's begin. At first, I need to create a grid-like pattern around the player. As I said previously, my method of generating objects around the player works with these chunks of objects that appear around the player. And to know where each chunk is, we need to create a grid around the player's position to know where on this grid the player currently is. I am doing that by taking player's position and rounding it to the nearest multiple of the cell size for both X and Y. This ensures that for any player's position, I get the position of the nearest cell center. My grid then consists of individual cells that are one cell size big and I can always find which cell the player is currently in by finding that cell's center from player's position. Next step is also very simple. I can now create a trigger on the position of the cell center. The trigger will be of rectangular shape and it will be as large as one cell size. When using commands, we of course need to take 1/2 of cell size, because that's how triggers work. They take the distance from the center to the edge, but we need to remember that this distance is only half of one total size. Just with this, I already have a system that can create objects based on what chunk the player is in. Of course, I can also easily reach the neighboring cells. Just as a demonstration, let's see where the cell to my north will be. We'll take our current cell's position. North direction is positive on the y-axis, so we will be adding values to the y-axis, and we will add cell size times multiplier, which in our case is 1, because we want to get the cell that is 1 unit away. To show it with actual numbers, if my current position is 100 on the x and 200 on the y-axis, and the cell size is 10, then my neighboring cell to the north will be at 100x, that one doesn't change, 200 plus 10 times 1, so 210. With this system, I can easily search for the position of my own grid cell, as well as pretty much any other cell around, so I already have the means to check where things are. This grid system is quite important, and as you will see, I use it a lot in other scripts as well. Let's move on to making walls around each cell. We already have the center position, we already have a trigger that covers the entire space of each cell, but the cells still aren't divided visually, so it's a little hard to imagine what's happening in the actual mission. I will create walls by a new script that takes position as input parameter, and of course I send my cell coordinates to the script. Then I will simply create 4 walls, one for each side. I use the for command for this. We need to remember how coordinates work. First of all, the starting coordinates are always the center of the cell, so we will need to offset those coordinates by 1/2 of cell size, while the direction will depend on which wall we are making, and secondly, we also need to remember the direction that we want to build the wall in. Let's demonstrate this on the western wall. Our for command tells us the direction in which we are building the wall, and we are building towards the north. So we will be moving along the y-axis, and we will start at -1/2 of cell size and move to +1/2 of cell size, going from the south to the north. Each step will be as big as one segment of the wall. And when creating each wall segment, we will offset its position. On the x-axis, we need to offset it by -1/2 of cell size, because we want to make it on the left side, so minus on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we will offset it by adding plus iteration variable, in my case lowercase I. The variable itself goes from negative to positive value, so we can just add it to the cell coordinates on the y-axis and it will move from below the coordinates to above. Same goes for all other walls, with just different directions. For the northern wall, we are moving along the x-axis and are offsetting each wall piece by I on the x-axis and by 1/2 of cell size on the y-axis. Same for the other two directions. Of course, you also probably need to change the direction of each wall piece as it's being created, so you can do that as well. Now you probably want to add some doors as well. We can do that quite easily by just adding a simple if-then condition. If my iterator is of certain value, then instead of making a piece of wall, you make a door. Since I'm going from negative values to positive values, I can wait until I reaches 0, make a door, and then keep making walls again. Since the cell size is always the same for all cells, my door will always be in the same spot, and with it being in the middle, it won't get replaced by a wall from the other cell. Related to this note, please understand that right now we are creating 4 walls in each cell, meaning this cell's north wall is in the exact same spot as my northern cell's south wall. This means that by creating a door on a more random position, it will likely be blocked by a wall from the neighboring cell. This is also why looking at my final script's code is such a headache. I am creating doors more randomly, where sometimes a door is more to the left or to the right, sometimes there's two doors next to each other, sometimes there's no door. Also, before creating any wall piece, I am also asking if there is a wall already on the same place, if I can really place a wall there. There's a couple more conditions, so the end result is a bit messy to read. However, it works on the same principle that I describe here. It just has a few little extra conditions thrown in. Here's also space for you to take a slightly different approach than me. You can ask if any wall exists at all at a particular spot, and then decide to skip an entire side, or set different priorities to wall pieces, door pieces, so that they don't exist on top of each other. I'm sure there are several other ways for you to make your walls. Alright, enough of that, let's move on. Now let's talk about expanding from one cell to multiple. We already have some triggers, walls and doors, so we can start making stuff happen in multiple locations at once. To do that, I am using the triggers I have created before. Each trigger is activated by player entering its area, and upon activation, it calls a script that does the following. First, the script looks for faraway cells and deletes objects that are too far away. Next, it looks at nearby cells and spawns objects there if they aren't already occupied. Thanks to our outside walls in each cell, we make sure that player always exits one cell and enters another because they are directly next to each other, so we can always count on there being other cells in the same pattern. The script deletes everything that is too far away if there is anything in the first place and creates new rooms nearby if these rooms don't exist yet. A little side note, it is entirely possible to run to a room, then run in a straight direction across several cells, turn back, go back in the exact same way, and reaching an entirely different new room layout. This is due to the old layout getting deleted once you get too far away from it, and new ones spawning as soon as you start heading back. This, however, fits into the lore of the mission I am creating, and is done intentionally in this way. If you wanted your rooms to be persistent but still loading and unloading around the player, then I would recommend picking your rooms based on an algorithm that calculates your position and picks numbers based on that. More on this topic later when we get to creating room layouts. For now, let's focus on how you can delete a cell, because you can't just grab all objects in a certain distance from the center. Well, you could, but you would need to calculate where you still can delete, where you cannot. You may delete an extra wall around the edges. They might not get replaced if you have your script set up that way. It's a little dangerous. What I am using instead is simply saving a reference to all the walls and doors into a variable and storing that variable in the trigger that represents an individual cell. When it's time to delete a cell, I find its coordinates, find the trigger, add those coordinates, and look for a variable inside the trigger's namespace from where I can pull all the objects I created, delete them, and finally delete the trigger itself. Just to make it clear, at first a trigger gets created at specific coordinates. Then this trigger gets passed to another script that creates walls around this trigger, and each wall piece gets saved to a variable. Once all walls are finished, this variable is saved in the trigger namespace with a specific name. Finally, once a different faraway trigger gets activated, this trigger is found, marked for deleting. So first a script searches for the preset variable names, deletes all objects that this variable contains, and then finally deletes said trigger. This is briefly how each trigger in the mission works. Since I am not creating all of them at the same time, but I'm only keeping some 12 or 13 of them at any moment, the mission is still quite demanding but not unplayable. Okay, let's add some more walls. What we did previously is what I call perimeter walls, because they mark the edge of each cell on the grid. Now we will make interior walls, which split the space inside each cell into individual rooms, corridors and halls. These interior walls work within their own completely separate system, and the script that manages them gets called after the outside perimeter walls are done. Once again, these interior walls are saved into a variable and saved to a trigger just like the other walls. These walls are not quite as random. The layouts are actually manually created, there's a bunch of them. I think I made 10 layouts for each stage of the mission, and the first set of 10 is manual only, while the other sets are very slightly randomized, but not a lot, it's still mostly manual work. Why did I decide to do this? Well, mostly for two reasons. One, only when making them manually I can ensure that these walls will form into actual rooms, hallways and not just a complete impassable mess. Remember that with the perimeter walls I am limiting where the player can go. Because there will be around 4 exits out of each cell, sometimes more, sometimes less, I cannot afford to make the interior impossible to navigate through, or make certain sections just walled off completely, because then the player could find themselves in a spot where they cannot progress anymore. If a perimeter door doesn't get created on a certain side, and other two sides are blocked off by bad interior wall generation, then the player gets cut off from any further progress. Second reason is more specific. I only got one kind of ceiling, with a big lamp in the middle, and I didn't want too many walls clipping into and through the lamp. So I went with a more manual approach that makes sure that the lamps are, at least mostly, in logical places and aren't built halfway through a solid wall. So the layouts are predetermined and handcrafted, but they are being picked at random when making new rooms, and the outside doors are also randomized, so the illusion of traversing an ever-changing yet somehow repeating set of corridors and rooms should be kept intact. It shouldn't be too samey so that the player notices a clear pattern, and it shouldn't be too different that the player never once recognizes a certain place and thinks they have already been there before. These rooms are created in a very simple manner. I have a faraway place on the map where I have a template room of sorts. This is where I design some interior layout for one cell. I then have a script that grabs the objects I placed and saves their type, position, rotation, and stores all of this info in an array. With a second script, I then read the array and make objects based on what information there is. So simply put, I design a layout in the editor, launch the mission, call my first script, it scans my template area, saves all the walls and doors into an array. I take that array and paste it into my second script, which then later, when I'm for real playing, creates these room layouts based on the template I provide in that array. In the creation of these layouts, I focus on making the layout somewhat believable. It cannot block any potential doors and exits leading to other cells, and it shouldn't clip into the lamps on the ceiling. This last rule doesn't always apply though, and that takes us directly to the next topic. As you keep playing, the environment doesn't remain always the exact same. Over time, you may start encountering new room layouts. This is done to keep the mission somewhat more entertaining, and to show that with time you are getting further from reality and the layouts get more distorted and less realistic, but you are also going slightly insane and can't tell if what you are seeing is reality or not. Of course, in-game, the time to go insane is vastly shortened. You start seeing new layouts only a couple minutes into the mission. But I don't think anyone is willing to walk around for several actual days, so I decided to make the progression somewhat fast. Just a little side note. There are 3 such groups of layouts or biomes if you wish. You always start in the first one, always move to the second one, and always end up in the third one, no matter where you go. The change of biome is not dictated by where you go, but by how far you have traveled. More on that later. For now, let's just say that after getting a certain distance away, the script will start picking random layouts from a different group of layouts, so we will start seeing changes. This is done quite simply and can be easily extended to more gradual change or having more layouts to pick from. All layouts are saved in a big array. Let's go with specific numbers. A big array contains 30 layouts in total because I have 10 layouts for 3 biomes. The mechanism is quite simple. I make it that the first 10 layouts are of biome 1, the second 10 layouts are of biome 2, last 10 layouts are of biome 3. And when picking the specific layout for an individual cell, I simply say pick any number between 1 and 10, and then pick a layout with that number. And in another script that checks for player position, I check if player traveled far enough, and if he did, I raise the starting number to pick from. So once the player travels far enough, I add a +10, and suddenly the same script is picking numbers from 11 to 20. Same for the third biome. Of course, I could add more biomes and more layouts per biome quite easily, and I can and also have already made the change more gradual by raising the initial number by just 5. So I can make the script pick more layouts from the first biome, some from the second, which would make the transition smoother. Now let's talk about how to recognize when it's a good time to move to another biome. As I said previously, it's not about reaching any specific place, the only thing that matters is how far the player traveled. And for that, there's another script. This one runs a loop for the first 20 minutes of the mission. It asks every 8 or so seconds for player's current position and compares it with the position that was recorded in the previous iteration. It then calculates the distance and works with that information. Just how far the player went in 8 seconds. This distance gets added to the overall distance, which is just a global variable that slowly increases with every new distance measured. The triggers in each cell also count how many times they have been activated, adding a +1 to the overall number for each time any trigger gets activated by a player entering the area. Technically speaking, if you were dancing in a doorway between 2 cells, you would repeatedly activate both triggers and increase this number a lot. Now back to the room layouts. Once the player visits enough rooms and travels far enough overall, the layout is allowed to change. Both conditions have to be met. This is to prevent abuse or unintended behavior. Let's imagine a couple scenarios. First, let's say that I will only care about overall distance from the starting point. As soon as the player runs at least 200 meters away from the start, the layout will change. Well, that surely will work, but it kinda forces the player to keep going in a certain direction. If someone makes it 190 meters away, then meets a solid wall and decides to instead head left, he will then continue along the boundary for many more minutes, getting seemingly nowhere. I don't want that. My goal is to make sure that no direction is labeled as more correct. If you walk in a big circle or in a straight line, both should result in the exact same outcome. It goes in hand with the lore as well, which says that the layout cannot be mapped out or make any logical sense. The rooms exist in dimensions we can't comprehend, and sometimes they curve and bend in impossible ways. So instead of measuring overall distance, I only measure distance in small chunks and let it slowly build up. Doesn't matter how actually far the player makes it, as long as they keep moving. This is why the first system exists, measuring how far away they went from the last measured position. This, however, could lead to someone running around in a small circle across one room, after they understand how the system works. And it would allow them to artificially gather enough distance points and they would avoid the exploration altogether. And that is not how I want the mission to work. So I added the second system of having to visit enough rooms. You have to activate a bunch of triggers and at the same time keep moving for long enough to trigger the change of environment and progress. This invites and rewards exploration. It doesn't differentiate between directions or methods of exploration and prevents the most blatant abuse from smart players. Of course, you could run around in a single room, then walk in and out of another one to gather both types of points and pass the conditions, but there has to be very specific, very intentional behavior that you wouldn't come up with without studying the code or me telling you. Any player who just wants to play the game will be prevented from accidentally abusing the system and rewarded for actually exploring in the most logical way, while the direction itself doesn't really matter. Now let's talk about the opposite scenario, if the player doesn't move enough. If for whatever reason the player decides to just sit down, relax and stay in some cozy little corner, well, let's just say that the back rooms are not a safe place, despite seeming empty. If the distance from last measurement is less than 3 meters, meaning if the player hasn't moved much at all in the last 8 seconds, a so-called lazy point gets added. It's just a global variable that starts at 0 and increases by 1 each time the player doesn't move far enough. As soon as he does, the variable resets back to 0. But if he doesn't move and accumulates enough lazy points, a special script gets called. It's actually one of the mission's endings. So let's move on to those. There are 3 endings in the mission. The first is the most simple, just keep walking for long enough, eventually you will visit enough rooms and get far enough that the script will call the first end sequence. An extra trigger gets added to the current cell and this trigger executes some code on deactivation, or when the player leaves the current cell. It blocks all newly created doors, effectively trapping the player in the current selection of cells, and creates an exit, essentially just a giant hole, in the cell that the player just left. So from the player's perspective, they come upon a closed, barred door, turn around, walk in confusion for a bit, then eventually they will return back because all other ways are blocked, and see that the previous room is gone and instead there's a giant hole. They jump into it and that's the first ending. The script waits until the player starts falling, then displays the ending and teleports the player away. Second ending I've already mentioned. Once the player stops moving for long enough, a script gets called that blocks all surrounding doors with extra wall pieces, trapping the player in a very small space. It then waits a bit, like half a minute, slowly fades the screen to black and displays the ending. Again, player gets teleported outside. There is a tiny chance that a player could technically escape if he gets super lucky with the layout with missing walls, which is also a thing but with very low chance. They could have a long enough section without any doors. Once this trapping mechanism starts, it only looks for nearby door objects to block them, but if there's simply gaps in the walls, and these gaps create a big enough space, then the player could run to areas that are no longer affected by the trapping mechanism. There's a very small chance of this happening, and it doesn't prevent the ending from triggering either. The script doesn't care about that. It blocks nearby doors, waits a bit, and then ends the mission anyway. Last ending is the Wanderer ending, and it's kinda in the middle between the previous two, which is why I would say it's the hardest to get. You need to keep moving to avoid the trapped ending, but you also cannot move far enough to trigger the escape ending. So you either have to avoid visiting enough cells or moving too far for the entire duration of the loop that checks for these things, meaning 20 full minutes. Do that, all conditions for the other endings will fail and you will get the Wanderer ending. I also prepared another example for you. This mission uses essentially the same basic scripts, but lacks many of the special effects, uses vanilla assets, and is much more straightforward and easier to grasp. So if you plan to study the code and specific commands, this might be a nice place to start. This mission is a dynamic practice course. Player runs through a series of small sections with different targets around, and as he progresses, more challenges appear. It works essentially the same, with a couple key differences. The biggest one is that new sections no longer spawn just everywhere around the player. Only one new section is added with a randomly picked direction from the current section. The direction is a random number from 0 to 3, where each number corresponds to one cardinal direction. There is obviously a check to make sure that the next room doesn't try and pick the place of the previous room, so that the creation can continue and player can just keep moving. Only one room at a time gets created. This means that the player can see objects being created and popping into existence, but yeah, so what? You can of course adjust this to your liking. Just keep in mind that if you leave things to a random chance, rooms can easily loop into themselves, so you have to remedy that situation. Another change is that rooms don't really change, like walking in and out of different sections doesn't do anything. Only when you enter a room for the first time, the next one is spawned, and after that you can walk around if you want. From this description alone, it should be pretty clear that pretty much the only change I had to do in the scripts was to set my triggers for each section to only fire once, instead of every time they are activated. This is done because I don't need to activate a trigger multiple times, there's no reason for it. And in fact, going back just to delete a new room sounds kinda silly in this mission I'm trying to make. Doors are always created in the middle of an outer wall. This means that the code for creating walls and doors is vastly easier to read and understand, and that you can expect the door to the next area to be in a reasonable location, see it faster as a player, and so on. The inner layouts are still handcrafted. You can customize them however you like. The important thing here is to keep each layout traversable. Remember, the exact spot from where you enter the room and the spot where you leave the room, those are both picked at random, more or less. You can expect it to be in the middle of the outer wall, but you don't know the direction of your entrance and exit. On the other hand, keeping things a little bit randomized means that the player will tackle similar situations from different angles. And the last change, kinda related to the triggers, is that there is a finite number of individual sections that spawn. Each trigger, upon activation, adds a +1 to the overall number of rooms visited. If enough rooms are visited, the last empty room that is meant to be like an exit indicator gets created, and upon entering that one, the practice is considered finished. You can customize the number of rooms you want to create. Since each trigger only activates once, getting the total number high enough to trigger the ending means you have to actually traverse enough rooms. At the end, the player is shown how much time they took and how many targets they hit. This is just, a concept. I don't really know what kind of data you need, so that's up to you to fill in, if you want to use this mission for anything. The scripts are made to be used in an already existing mission, so you can put them into another mission and call whenever necessary. The downside is that the objects themselves need a lot of completely flat ground, which isn't very common, maybe the Salt Lake on Altis or virtual reality worlds. Either way, you can customize that however you wish, and not just copy-paste the scripts, but use them instead as a basic framework for something that actually suits your specific needs. I would also like to briefly mention licensing, because this project uses more than just my own work. The mission's code was written by me, so as usual, do whatever you wish with it. Although don't forget that Arma by itself has some rules on who owns what and how you can monetize your work. The associated mod was created and is owned by me and Sparkle Kitten. You are free to use the mod for your missions, of course, include it in mod packs or collections, all of the usual stuff. If you would like to make changes to it, make your own version, then that's fine as well. It would be nice if you kept us as the original creators, but you can make your own spin on the mod if you so desire. Should you want to expand on the mod with new models or fix the ones that are already existing, in other words, join the team as a contributor and creator, feel free to contact me on email, Steam, Discord, over here, and we'll sort things out. I have no problems with it either. It just needs some minimal coordination. The mission also uses some sound effects from freesound.org. Most of them have no license associated with them, but I think there's one or two sounds that have a Creative Commons license and you have to credit the original author. I did that. If you decide to use the sound effects as well, please follow the rules and credit the authors as well. If you download the mission source files, you can open up a text file with a list of all music and sound effects used, including all the links to original authors, their licenses, and what you need to do with each file. Usually I don't have to mention this because most of my work is just me and I don't care, but this time more people are involved and I would like to make sure their rights are respected, so that we are on good terms. So if you could, please respect the authors of each part of the project. In this last section, I would like to just briefly talk about some of the development process and rejected ideas. I'm sure that there are things you would like to see added, just so you know that I experimented with a variety of ideas and the exact look of the final mission changed over time. I started with the vanilla assets, initially trying out several different methods of generating walls around the player. I didn't want to repeat one of my other missions, the maze, which is in many aspects very similar. So instead of focusing on some specific generation algorithm, I focused initially on having things appear only around the player and not everywhere at once, and then slowly realized that maybe full automation isn't the way to go, and that maybe it will be better if I create some stuff by hand. I got a prototype for the current mission working and asked my friend SparkleKitten to make some custom assets so that the atmosphere is more believable. At this point, I already knew from various experiments that the AI is completely hopeless at navigating such small spaces without specific handmade paths to follow, so I knew AI will either be completely static or missing. I also tried experimenting with rendering to texture, creating mirrors and illusions, but Arma is quite limited in this regard, and I couldn't really make a satisfying result. Some objects were shown through the texture, the quality wasn't fantastic even on highest graphical settings, the objects were hard to work with, so I eventually had to give up on the idea. There were also experiments with other vanilla objects, namely the industrial pipes. I really wanted to make a section that would be more industrial, like little maintenance corridors, but there were a few issues as well. The pipe objects don't quite align with each other for some reason, they are way too complex to create from scratch, and I would also need industrial walls, floors, ceilings, ladders or stairs, not to mention that such a big expansion would delay the release by another couple of months. However, this idea was probably the most developed one, and if I get the energy and resources to continue working on this project, I would most probably want to head this way and make an industrial-like section. Originally, once the player stops moving, there were plans for AI to spawn nearby and slowly move towards the player, and they would kill the player upon contact. But it always looked kinda goofy, and I would need custom animations, textures, maybe even models, making sure they don't clip through walls, that they locate the player, a lot of effort for a very small addition. So I went with making the environment itself being the enemy here. On that note, initially only doors out of sight would get blocked off, but that could potentially lead to the player just continuing in a certain direction forever, and I didn't have good ways to recognize whether the player is actually trapped or not. This might also be another small thing I would try to fix in the future, make it a bit less obvious at first sight, and make the door blocking script a bit more intelligent, recognizing that the player truly got stuck. But I don't have many good ideas for that at the moment, so it is what it is. Stationary NPCs were a thing I almost added towards the end, but I wasn't sure if I could find voice actors, so instead I made a couple hidden journal pages and added those. They are ridiculously hard to find, by the way, they are super hard to see on the floor, but they are there, and once the millionth player actually finds one, it will start a mystery hunt. Or not, since you can just open the script and read the journals there. As for the idea of backrooms as inspiration, well, I like the original concept, not so much the newer community creations, but I find it fun to explore a little. It felt right in line with some of my other weed creations, and making stuff that has nothing in common with Military Simulator can often help you find limits of the editor, of the scripting framework, and show you how much you can bend and twist Arma to fit your needs. But also what parts you simply cannot change no matter what. The mission went through many small changes, lots of stuff got added, changed, switched around, tons of bugs had to be ironed out, but in the end I'm quite happy with the results. Hopefully it will serve both as a good experience for those few folks who are interested in this sort of playstyle, and as a good resource for mission makers. Maybe in the future Arma games this will be the first stepping stone for an actually good backrooms themed mission. Final recap: to play the mission or use the associated mod, Steam Workshop, you can find both of those there. To edit the mission or see the code behind it, download the provided folder. There is also the slightly alternative mission example using a very similar but reduced code to show you how some subtle changes can create a vastly different result. Links to all of that is down below the video. If you would like to contribute to the project or have some important feedback, let me know. I have a couple smaller ideas I would like to add to the project, but I'm not sure if I'll actually implement them or not, with my limited resources and few people to bounce ideas off of. So I'm not promising anything. And that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you all for watching and listening, if you still are. Hopefully all of this will be of some use to you. Best of luck with your own projects and have a nice day.